So, an important part of understanding equity, diversity, and social issues or social justice issues is understanding the connection between bias and power. So, when we combine the power that we have in a system or in a community or in society with biases that we might hold, whether implicitly or explicitly, we can reproduce these things called oppression or oppressions. So when we think about oppression, we can think about all the isms that we talk about: racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ageism. So it's important to look at this equation, and I'll unpack it with kind of a personal example to help sort of explain how I understand this. So I moved to Minnesota about 9 years ago. And a few years ago, I decided to become a Minnesota Vikings fan. Now, I apologize if any of you are not Minnesota Vikings fans or not football fans for this example, but hopefully it'll help demonstrate this concept. Um, when I became a Minnesota Vikings fan, I formed a very explicit bias towards the Philadelphia Eagles. And this is a few years back when the Philadelphia Eagles was one of the biggest competitors of the Minnesota Vikings. To the point that I would see the colors of the Philadelphia Eagles, and I would get nauseous, seeing green and gray. Now, this bias was a competitive bias, one that we see often when we're cheering for our teams or for maybe a certain candidate or whatever might be the case. And so highlights that we can have bias in different ways. Now, what I suggest is in my explicit bias towards the Philadelphia Eagles, I didn't really have a lot of power in that situation. I couldn't go down and change the goal line or call up the coaches. So I wasn't necessarily reproducing something, some form of oppression. Something called eagleism doesn't necessarily exist in our culture, historically or currently. And so that example just highlights that, yes, we can have different preferences, biases. However, when we start to add those biases with power that we have, either individually or collectively as a group, again, we can reproduce these forms of oppression. So another part of the story is that as I was following the football season, and this was a few years back when the Minnesota Vikings were on their way to the Super Bowl, and the Philadelphia Eagles had beat them, and now the Philadelphia Eagles were going to come to Minnesota for the Super Bowl and come to the Twin Cities. And I was reading a lot about the season and hearing folks write about these Philadelphia Eagles fans that were going to come to Minnesota and to the Twin Cities and destroy our town, and that they were going to be uncivilized and rowdy and trash our community. And as I was reading this, I realized that those words, uncivilized, rowdy, trashy, were also terms that I had learned as someone raised in a middle upper class family to use in a derogatory way towards working class poor individuals and communities. So as I was reading things in the media, I started to catch some of what I would consider some of my own implicit bias and ways I had been socialized to think about groups of people. Now, there is a stereotype and a reality that many Philadelphia Eagles fans come from working class poor communities. And so for me, I started to catch what I was reading and made sure that I wasn't reproducing some of this language and even challenging some of this language. So that's just another example of how implicit bias can play out. Now, if I was reproducing this language, I could have been impacting folks around me. I could have been absorbing it unconsciously and continuing to reproduce that. Now, me just catching that one incident where I was noticing some stereotypes and assumptions about a group of people didn't completely eliminate a lifetime of socialization. I still have a lot to work on in terms of my own classism and the stereotypes that I have about working class poor and homeless communities, as well as the power and privilege that I have as someone who is middle upper class. So it is ongoing work, but I use this personal example just to highlight and distinguish the difference between sort of a general bias or dislike or like that we might have versus one that we have that's wrapped up in our own social identities, and in which then we have oppression being reproduced.